Today is May 16, 2017, and we are in the Feast of Unleavened Bread of the second month, studying the community rule. Let's start with asking our Heavenly Family to bless us with a coherent study. Heavenly Family, thank you so much for all the wonderful blessings that you give to us. Thank you for this great day and for the opportunity that we have now to advance in knowledge of the message and to come to understand the principles of acquiring knowledge and the principles of becoming people of love. So please guide us, sprinkle upon us waters of purification, and bring about the people who can bring about the final wiping away of sin. Thank you so much. Guide us. Bring this about to be the best study that it could possibly be. Toda, thank you. We ask this, B'Shem Tzemach Hu Hi, in the name of branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
True that. So, of course, we'll be going through our regular pattern. The regular pattern, of course, is a brief summary of the community rule and an explanation of our methods of study and why we are studying it. And also, or thereafter, the next phase, is questions and answers and comments broadly related to the community rule. And then we'll go into a line-by-line investigation of its contents. So first, what is the community rule? Let me ask, would anyone like to give a brief summary of what the community rule is?
Okay, well, I thought I'd give others an opportunity, but since I don't hear anything yet, I'll give a brief description of what the community rule is, as far as I know. Okay, so it's a document found in the first cave found at the site of Qumran, near the Dead Sea. Is it the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea? And there are several different copies of the community rule. The best copy we have is the one found in the first cave. There's other copies, some not as full as this one, if I remember correctly, that were found in Cave 4 as well. And there doesn't appear to be a claim as to who wrote it for sure. We don't know who wrote it, but that's one of the reasons why we're investigating it, to try to see if we can determine if it's a product of inspiration or not. It has a lot of language similar to what we would find in the Thanksgiving hymns, and they were written by the founder of the Qumran community around 2nd century BCE, and he was definitely an inspired messenger, he or she, but I'm thinking probably he. And so the community rule is kind of like a bylaws and stuff like that. It's kind of an outline of the government of the community, and it is its stated purpose in the body of the text is said to be to bring about the wiping away of sin, the atonement. So that's another big reason why we want to investigate it, because, hey, that's the claim that it has, and if it really is inspired, then this is given to us by our Heavenly Family as an outline, principally based of how to accomplish the atonement, the wiping away of sin. So it's very, very important. And trying to think of what else to mention about the community rule. Maybe that's it. I'll just stop there. I know that there's more, of course, but nothing's really coming to my mind at the moment of something significant to say.
Okay, excellent. No, I mean, those are all very good points, and it's a fair summary of the community rule. Does anyone else want to add anything?
It's a forerunner of the Christian movement.
So, and I take it, of course, you're referring to the movement described in the community rule being a forerunner movement to the Nazarenes, rather than like the community rule itself being a forerunner, because, of course, it's a text, but the text is connected to a movement. Indeed.
They had a movement similar. They quoted from the community rule.
They being the Nazarenes?
Right, the Nazarenes, followers of Christ.
Yes. Anything else to add?
I'm thinking.
Okay, cool.
So far,
anyone
that's
can
all.
feel free to chip in.
And they didn't get along with their people of their time because they were a little stricter, or anyway, they weren't liked for one reason or other by the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the other ones. So that's why they started the community out away from the rest of them.
Well, I'll say that the teacher of righteousness seems to have undergone some negative treatment from, people who were in leadership in his day. But after that, the followers of the teacher of righteousness, known as the Essenes, ended up being very well respected by at least Pharisees and potentially other groups of Jews. Josephus was a Pharisee. He really liked the Essenes and spoke so highly of them. And Philo spoke very highly of the Essenes as well. And, he was a Hellenistic Jew. He was kind of, influenced a lot by Greek culture. And he really respected the Essenes. So I just wanted to say that just to give a bit of the broader picture in terms of how they were viewed by others.
There really wasn't any Pharisees or Sadducees around when the teacher of righteousness was there, so it must have been some other reason why they moved out there. Was there?
Right. Yeah, they moved out into the wilderness to fulfill the prophecies of Isaiah, to prepare the way in the wilderness. And so that was, a big deal. And, and in terms of there being no Pharisees and Sadducees in their day, that could be the case, or perhaps they didn't go by that name. That's all a history to learn more of.
Otherwise, Jews like to be in Jerusalem.
Well, some Jews, I guess, but of course most Jews lived outside of the land of Israel. There was lots of Jews everywhere from Egypt to Rome and, all abroad. So, but yeah, definitely it was still, even those who lived abroad still had some sort of central focus on Jerusalem because that's where the temple was.
That's where they would come for the feast.
Indeed. So how about the community rule in terms of its importance? Does anyone want to explain anything in regard to why the community rule is an important document?
Well, it's a forerunner of the followers of Christ, so it's got to be important.
Yeah, the fact that the community rule describes a movement which was a forerunner movement to the Jesus movement is definitely one of the reasons why it is important. Any other reasons?
Yeah, I got one.
Okay.
It will give us instructions as to how to wipe away the final sin.
Yes, that is a very important aspect of why the community rule is so significant. Absolutely.
Where do I find that little bit of knowledge there? I seem to have forgot just where it is. Where it says we're here for the wiping away of sin.
You're wondering where that is in the community rule?
Yes.
Okay, so that is in several places. The phrase that, or the place that words it closest to that is in column 8, which we have not gone through in detail yet, but we have had a study where I go through and show that that is the purpose of the community rule, to produce a people, first a group of 12 and 3, which will be like the most holy place for the house of Aaron, and will accomplish the final atonement. And atonement means wiping away, and it's talking about the atonement for sin and all of that. So that's one place there. It's in column 8. And then also, even the first chapter talks about, the master shall teach the saints to live according to the book of the community rule, so that, and then it goes on and explains all of the things that he is teaching them to live according to the community rule for. And that includes the setting up of the kingdom, the, basically purification, and all of these different things that are described in column 1. And then there's several other places throughout the community rule where it describes what it is to be like in the community and how it's all about purity, bringing about purification, righteousness, and all of these different things. Even the section that we're looking at now in column 4 describes the destruction of sin once and for all and the establishment of truth and righteousness. And it's quite evident in the context that that is what the community rule is interested in doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so would anyone like to explain our methods of studying the community rule?
To understand it from the other author's view?
Yeah, absolutely. That's very important. It's so that we can understand what the author's view is rather than just our own interpretation of what they might be saying. And then once we get that understanding, what do we do with that?
Compare it with other scriptures?
that's certainly one thing that we can do, and the reason for comparing it with other scriptures is to be like a kind of a check system for ourselves to make sure that we are not going to judge the community rule using a different set of rules than what we might use when judging a book that we're familiar with. And so, like, someone will be less likely to throw out the Psalms than to throw out the community rule. And so if someone reads something in the community rule that they at first don't initially like, well, they might want to just throw it away. But if you find that that same thing is in the Psalms, it causes someone to slow down and say, hey, wait a second, I need to evaluate this closely and make sure that I'm being consistent. And if the idea that's in the community rule that the person doesn't immediately like is actually a false idea, well, then they should throw away the community rule, but they should also throw away any of the other writings which promote that, even if it's in the Psalms or in some other writing that they're familiar with. But if it is a true principle, and they can see that it is true in the Psalms or in Deuteronomy or Genesis or, whatever, those are just examples. If they can see that it's true there, well, then if it's teaching the same principle in the community rule, they should accept that it's true in the community rule as well. So it helps to be consistent in judging the community rule, which is one of the other things that is, an aspect of our methods in studying it. We're attempting to judge whether it is teaching truth or falsehood. Is it really correct? Are its claims correct? So first we have to understand its claims, and then we have to test whether those claims are true, and comparing it with other writings helps us in that testing. So there are two things in particular that I've mentioned that we really, I've mentioned this over the past few nights as to, a couple things that we are really looking for in the community rule, a certain two different main claims that might be there that we really want to find out, that we are particularly interested in. Does anyone remember what those two aspects are? I'll mention the first one, and maybe you guys will, maybe someone here will mention the second one. So the first one that we're particularly interested in finding out is whether the community rule claims to be written under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And, one way that we might find out is if it claims to be written by the teacher of righteousness, or, if it makes some sort of other direct claim. And then, of course, we want to find out if that claim is true. So that's one main thing. And then there's another thing that we want to find out that's a really important point that we want to know, well, what does the community rule have to say about this? So does anyone remember what it is?
I'm trying to think of something, what the community rule says about, is that what you said, what it says about something? Would that be on the justification by faith? I'll take a stab
at it. That's basically it. Someone, you could use different terms to describe it, but it's basically what it has to say about morality. Does it give a true view of morality and a true means of becoming moral, ridding ourselves from immorality, or does it promote something false in that regard?
As you pointed out last night, that would make it really easy to determine if anything is true or not. And that's basically the method we would have to apply to any of the Bible books, because we can't just take something handed to us from someone else, and they say, here, this is inspired. Here, these 66 books are inspired. Just don't worry about it. We've already checked it out. It's good to go. Here you go. Mm-hmm. Don't worry about anything else. This is all you need. And everything here is absolutely correct. You don't need to check it out. Okay. Well, we want to check it out. And so how do we check it out? What do we test it by? Well, you have to test it by, one of the things obviously would be, does it claim, like you say, inspiration? And if something's not teaching true morality, if it's teaching any other of the false ideas of morality, then it's easy to know that it's not true. That's basically what you were saying.
Yeah, it's pointing out that it's not just with the community rule, it's with any text that we want to find out what its moral system is, because if it has a corrupt moral system, then it's useless for our purposes, because what we're interested in is true moral philosophy and the practical application thereof. And because that's ultimately it. And so, last night in talking about this, I reminded everyone about how, there's so many problems in the world, but the root of so many of these problems is really selfishness. And so that's the main thing that needs to be addressed. And that's why, this morality issue is so, so important. So that's basically it. We want to find out, does it claim inspiration, and does it claim a true moral system inclusive of the only coherent, correct means of transforming ourselves from immoral people to moral people. And so that's basically it. That's those 2 points. Yes, we want to find out all of its claims, and we have to test all of its claims, but those are a couple things that we should really have our eyes open for with any text that we read. We want to know, what does it claim? Does it claim inspiration? And what is its moral message? Those are like 2 very primary fundamental things that we ought to ask when reading anything. And of course, if the text does not claim inspiration, and if it's moral, if it doesn't have a moral message, let's say, or even if it has one that is kind of skewed, it doesn't mean it's entirely useless. It may be a history book. It may be on something else. But if something claims inspiration for sure, we definitely need to know what moral system it advocates.
Comment?
Sure.
Is that the same as asking it, is it material or immaterial?
Not exactly. I mean, it's different, but that is something that would definitely help in a sense. But here's the thing. There are people who are materialists, but who do not have a correct moral system, who go by a social moral system. And then they don't really recognize that there is an inconsistency there, but there are people who would consider themselves materialists and who more or less are, but don't have a correct moral system. And then the other thing is, someone could, in theory, have the correct moral system, but they could define truth as not being rooted in materialism. They might define truth as something else. And so, of course, that's not really the correct moral system. That's why I said, in theory, they could have the same structure. They could have what they might call a truth-based moral system. But, of course, it won't be truth-based so long as it's not material reality-based. But I'm wanting to kind of point out that there is a difference in the point of emphasis between asking what moral system it puts forward and asking what philosophy of substance it puts forward. Both are really important, but both are separate. although in order for things to be really clear, both of those things need to be together. But I will say that in the ancient world, they would not have divided the categories as we do when it comes to the philosophy of substance. In other words, is there one fundamental substance in the universe, two fundamental substances? Is it just material? Is it just immaterial? Is it both? Is it, something else? What is it? In the ancient world, people did not even have the categories of natural and supernatural. And, a lot of the ancient Israelite texts don't even know what, they don't even, address that divide, because that divide did not exist. And, you can see that things are placed in a materialistic framework, but it's not like it's in contrast to the immaterial, because they didn't think of it exactly in those ways. So I just wanted to mention that, just to keep that in mind when we're reading a text. Yes, we can still ask those questions, but we have to recognize that the way that we are approaching it is different from how the ancient people approached it. And the other thing to keep in mind is someone might promote a certain aspect of reality as being solely material, but then not another aspect. So, for instance, there are, because I have searched, there are some Christians who call themselves in some regard some sort of materialist, but really only in regard to the nature of man. So some of these Christians believe that human beings are entirely material, that we do not have an immaterial soul or spirit or anything like that embedded within us, but they still believe in a non-physical God. And so they're not really strictly materialists, even though they might in some regards think of them as materialists. And in regard to some questions, they have a materialist answer. And it's the same thing for, scientists there's a lot of scientists are atheists, and a lot of scientists do not believe in the supernatural realm. And many of them would consider themselves materialists, yet in regard to some questions, they will put forward immaterialist answers. The common model right now for the Big Bang is immaterialist, because it speaks of an existence before time, space, and matter. Well, that doesn't even make sense. There can be no existence without time, space, and matter. And the common understanding of the Big Bang is definitely immaterialistic, although that's not recognized by these individuals who would consider themselves materialists. So I just want to mention that, because in testing claims, we may, for instance, read an ancient text, an ancient Jewish text, and it may be materialistic when it comes to the body of Yahweh or the bodies of Yahwehs. It may be materialistic in regard to that and put forward the idea that God is physical. Yet, it might then, when it comes to the question of the state of the dead, speak of a conscious state of the dead, and the idea that there's some sort of spirit or soul or something within us that leaves us when we die, and different things like that. And of course, that's an immaterial idea. So I kind of wanted just to explain those nuances so that we can keep it kind of straight in our minds that, hey, just because we read something and it's materialistic in one regard doesn't mean it is in every regard. And, in testing it, that is something to ask for. And I will say, Leroy, I'm glad that you mentioned this, because in addition to asking, does this claim inspiration, and what is its moral philosophy, another primary question to ask is, what is its substance philosophy? Is it materialist or is it immaterialist?
What do you do with people that believe God is a person, but yet he can walk through doors and be everywhere at once, in everybody's heart, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, that greatly depends on what the individual is ready for. So, in other words, that's not really like enough information about a person. The fact that they might think that isn't enough information to know what to do with that individual. And so, first thing is to find out more. I mean, unless you already know more about them, and it'll be a whole bunch of different aspects about the person that will instruct you on kind of how to respond to them or how to help them. And, it will be different for different people, for sure.
You can only take so much so fast.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I think we have summarized pretty well what the community rule is, why it is important, and our methods for studying it, and the reason for our studying it. So with all that said, does anyone have any comments or questions on the community rule itself or things related to the community rule?
I had a question about the morality thing. How do we find the true morality? To compare all the other ones to.
How do we find it?
Yeah, how do we know what the true one is to compare the other ones to?
I'll answer your question with a question, and it may help to direct your mind to the right place. How do you know the correct answer to any question? Or I'll phrase it differently. How do you know whether any claim is true or false?
By experimenting.
Right, conducting an experiment. And what does that, what is it to conduct an experiment?
Well, one thing, is it material? Is it provable?
Okay, yeah.
Did it happen?
Sure, yeah. If it's a question about the past, did it happen? And of course, when we say did it happen, we mean did it happen in material reality? And so every experiment is designed to test whether the claim corresponds to material reality. Or if it's not an experiment which is testing a particular claim, it might just be observational in nature, or to find out, what happens when we do this. So it'll either be in order to answer a certain question or to verify or falsify a certain claim. So with that in mind, that's how we, if that's really what it is with material reality, if materialism is true, which, we've argued many times in the past that materialism absolutely must be true, because what it means for something to be true is for it to correspond to material reality. The words
words have their definition according to their usage. And if you want to know what a word means, you have to see how it's used. And the thing is, there are literally billions of examples that could be given. And that's, by the way, I'm just stating a fraction of it. There's actually more than that. But there's billions and billions and billions of examples that could be given to demonstrate that what it means for something to be true is for it to correspond with material reality. And there are actually no examples that could be given that can be objectively verified to be a valid example of truth meaning anything other than that. So, because of that, yeah, materialism is absolutely true, and there's no evidence to the contrary. And now, if that's the case, and of course it is, then we have to test all claims according to material reality. And that's how we must test moral claims as well. So that's how you can find out which moral system is the true moral system, by testing it according to material reality. And perhaps even more direct to the point is to say, because when you're talking about testing the validity of a system, well, here's the thing. If the system does not even claim to base itself on material reality, well, then that's an easy way to falsify it. So, if you look at, the claims of different moral systems, and you find out, well, this one claims to be based off of social structures, this one claims to be based off of divine authority, and this one claims to be based off of material reality. Well, understanding materialism, that makes the answer quite obvious, depending on exactly what the claim is. Because, for instance, if you look at the claim that morality is actually just a social construct, well, you'd have to ask someone, what does that mean? Does that mean that when someone claims that it is good to rape and murder, and that's accepted within their society, does that mean that it is actually good? Or does it only mean that they consider it to be good? Because you can describe morality as a social phenomenon, because social morality, secular morality, does accurately describe how moral systems usually work in the world. And in that sense, it's a correct model because it describes how the systems work. But it doesn't describe how morality itself works. So for that, you have to have truth-based morality. And so that's how you can determine what the correct moral system is, and then you can test all others according to whether they correspond to material reality.
So every social group, they have some kind of thing they all agree on is all right to do.
Yeah, each group, this is how groups actually work, where you have, one tribe there, another tribe there, a nation over there, a subculture here and there, or a religious group, or whatever it may be. And within that group, a generally agreed upon code of conduct will develop, and that will basically be their moral system. Now, that doesn't mean that that moral system is going to be in agreement with another moral system. It may look really weird and not make any sense to people outside of it. And it may, like the claims concerning morality within that moral system, it may actually contradict material reality. and that's why we would say that they are not true moral systems. But that is the way it works, because most people do not base their moral system off of material reality. And so that's why secular morality as a model for describing how the actually existing moral systems function in the world, social morality is the accurate description of that. And that's why it actually kind of has a, it's kind of closer to the truth in a sense, not in its system, but it has more value than the divine authority system, because this one at least accurately describes what's going on in the world. But that doesn't mean that it is the way it should be going on in the world, and it doesn't mean that that is actually a description of what morality is. It's only a description of how people develop their views of what is and what is not moral.
That's generally based on the gods they worship, right?
Yeah, not necessarily. I mean, that is one way that people come to their morals, but there are also lots of other ways that people come to their morals, having to do with the type of government they live in, having to do with literally their geography even influences the jobs that people have, and the jobs that people have influences the culture, and the culture influences the moral system. The history of the group, if there's some significant events in their past where a figure that they look up to did something, they'll be more likely to look at that thing as a good thing or a moral thing. And so I mean, there's many, many factors, and then there are people groups that are non-theistic, and of course they have moral systems too. And in those circumstances, it's not at all influenced by how they conceive of a God, because they don't conceive of a God as being real, but yet they have a moral system that is rooted on other things, whatever they agree upon as their code of conduct, usually based off of, principles like, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. I don't want this to happen to me, so I won't do it to you. Things like that, like general principles that people usually agree on, and that ends up forming the basis for the moral system.
Does morality basically have to do with male and females, or?
What do you mean by that?
Well, how males relate to females, or I guess it relate to children and grown-ups or adults, other things too.
Morality basically relates to, and it depends if you're asking this in regard to true morality or in regard to how people usually deal with morality. In regard to true morality, it has to do with whether actions are in harmony or out of harmony with material reality. Those actions could be performed by any person of any gender, of any age, in relation to either just themselves or to others of any gender, any age, any number of people, anything like that. It's just actions that are either against or in harmony with material reality.
It doesn't have to be other humans either.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be other humans, you're right. It could be actions in regard to anything, other beings, other objects. Yeah, the planet itself. You
destroy the planet on which we live. Well, that's not very moral. You're destroying actual reality.
Exactly. So, there's lots of things about, true morality is very encompassing. Social morality, in a social moral system, it will either, it may you could have a moral system that is far more limited, and there might be a lot of things that might be viewed as not being moral issues, and then there are other things which might be viewed as being moral issues. Usually how people deal with each other is included in social moral systems.
One person with another.
Sure, yeah, that would be a portion of it in most systems, if not all systems.
Oh, I had a thought on when you're doing experiments, that means you're getting experience. You're not taking information from somebody else. You're the one that checked it out and saw what the results were. You get experience, personal experience when you're doing experiments.
Yes, that's how Ellen White describes experience. She says experience is knowledge derived from experiment.
You have that knowledge. You're not taking it from somebody else.
Now, I do have to put a qualifier on this, though, because it could be misunderstood. This is not to say, because, we've talked about in the past how there are two basic types of experiment. There's direct experiment and there's indirect experiment. Direct experiment is a circumstance where an individual has the knowledge and ability to directly conduct some sort of experiment to directly answer a question. So, example, if I could take a hammer and hit my own thumb to find out whether it hurts. And that would be a direct way to find out, and that's a direct experiment. But that's only one type of experiment. There's another type of experiment, which is indirect experiment. And you could have the question, would it hurt for me to hit my thumb with this hammer? And in fact, in this circumstance, certainly indirect experiment is the way to go, but it's still the individual conducting the experiment and is thus knowledge personally gained through the experiment. But the experiment in this instance, if it's indirect, will be to judge the validity of the experiments of others and to understand their implications in regard to the experiment which you might conduct yourself, but which you will not, because you recognize it's probably not the best idea. So you could say, well, others have told me that they have hit their thumbs with hammers and that it hurt, and you could do an experiment to find out whether they're lying. So you could say, I could find 100 people who say that this hurts, and all the evidence points to them telling the truth, because it would be quite the conspiracy and quite the joke that someone would have to pull. Maybe one person could say, oh yeah, that won't hurt, ha ha ha, trying to get you to hit your own thumb with a hammer. But it's very unlikely that there's going to be 100 people that are going to tell you that same, that are going to pull that same stunt on you, basically. And so you could do an experiment to find out, okay, what's the likelihood that what these people are saying is true? And you could determine, yeah, it is. And then you put that together with the fact that, hey, if you hit something else with a hammer, well, it gets greatly compressed. And when I have parts of my body greatly compressed like that, especially with high velocity and so on and so forth, yeah, that hurts. So you could kind of, do an indirect experiment. Or if you want to know whether, someone knows how to build a radio, well, you don't have to know how to build it yourself and to do all these experiments. Or let's say you just want to know if it's possible, the idea of a radio, if it's possible. Well, you don't have to do a direct experiment in relation to how to build a radio and how to make it work and everything. But you can test whether people who claim to be able to make radios, whether they actually have valid experiments, and thus you can know whether they're valid. And you can do that simply by turning on the radio. There are many examples that I could give, but I just wanted to put that forward so everyone can keep in mind that while experiment is necessary, let's not confuse that with the idea that direct experiment is necessary, because direct experiment is not necessary. In fact, even where direct experiment is present, indirect experiment is far more conclusive, because indirect experiment is the only way to bring in the results from a plethora of experiments, and thus you get a broader knowledge base and can have a fuller understanding of the questions that you ask. If you just go on direct experiment, you will not be able to gain anything close to a full knowledge of reality, because you don't have the knowledge or the ability to be able to conduct experiments yourselves on every question. But you can do experiments to determine the validity of the experiments of others. So
you can use your mind.
Really important to keep in mind.
You can use your mind and use reason and logic.
Well, yes, we can use our mind, use reason and logic, that's for sure. But we have to be careful, because the logic and reason that most people employ is not experimental. And it's not, so that's the thing to keep in mind, because, you have this debate in philosophy that's been going on for a long time between rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism said that basically we can use reason and logic, that's the purest form and the best form to come to a knowledge of the truth. Empiricism says we have to check it by experiment according to demonstrable facts. And that's really where the test comes. That's what's most important. It comes to physical experiments, not simply reason and logic, because our reason and logic can be off. Our reason and logic has to be determined by the material experiments, and we have to constantly check our reason and logic according to those experiments. So, like, for instance, take theoretical physics. Well, in theoretical physics, there's a lot of ideas, and there's a lot of stuff that works out nicely on paper. There's mathematical constructs and all these different things, and people believe in certain theories because it works out mathematically. But guess what? Mathematics is not material reality. And you can work out a mathematical system that is even beneficial, but that does not correspond to material reality. And so, math is logic and reason, that sort of thing. But it's not the same as experiment. And so that's why every hypothesis put forward by theoretical physicists, before it can be accepted as a factual working theory, has to be subjected to experiment. And this is why, like, in physics now, like, there's something called string theory, and there's people who are excited about it and who think that, it really makes sense, but it has not had any support by means of experiment. No experimental basis for it. And so a lot of people have kind of given up hope in it, because it's like, hey, you know what? If it doesn't work out in experiment, if it can't be shown through experiment, it is of no practical value. we cannot actually determine that it is true or is an accurate model, no matter how reasonable it may seem and how beautifully it might play out through mathematical logic. It comes down to the experiment. So that's why I want to distinguish even indirect experiment is not the same as simply reasoning something out or using logic. It's actually going a step further to conduct actual experiments that are not direct on the question that you're trying to answer, because you may be unable to do that, but are direct on the experiments of others who are directly conducting experiments on the question that you have. So an example that I've given before is the dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, well, how are the Dead Sea Scrolls dated? Well, there's several methods. One is paleography, studying the form of the characters to find out the date of the text, because writing styles develop over time. And then you have radiocarbon dating by means of accelerator mass spectrometry. And then you also have archaeology, and there are other methods involved, but those are the three main ones. Okay, well, what if you don't know how to do radiocarbon dating yourself? Does that mean that you can't know what the date is? How about if you can't do radiocarbon dating, archaeology, or paleography? What if you can't do any of those three methods directly yourself? Does that mean that, you just can't know? Or does it even mean that you have to resort simply to, using your own logic and reason and like, well, I think this is probably like this. I saw the manuscript. It looks pretty, well preserved, so it's probably recent. That's the way people did it at first with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were wrong. They just used what they thought was reasonable. They kind of used reason and logic and like, oh, well, this, the first scrolls were very well preserved, so, it's pretty unlikely that they could last for 2,000 years, and still be this well preserved, so they're probably from the medieval period, No, that didn't work. So these other methods had to come in. But these other methods cannot be performed by anyone because it takes a lot of knowledge and ability to perform paleographical analysis, because you have to know what the characters look like in general at each period of time. Like, how about in the first half of the 4th century BCE? Well, how about the second half of the 4th century BCE? How about the first half of the 3rd century? And, you keep going like in 50-year chunks, and you have to know what the actual letters look like that people wrote in each of those periods of time in order to date this. So you have to know how to read Hebrew. When it comes to dating Hebrew manuscripts, you have to be really familiar with the handwriting of a lot of different individuals in order to know what it was like and to be able to accurately date it. Well, you know what? It's not going to work for everyone to gain that knowledge. To do radiocarbon dating, you can't just go counting carbon atoms just by looking at something. No, you have to take a sample and run it through very specialized equipment. That's what AMS is, accelerator mass spectrometry. And, it's really an advanced technology that counts individual carbon atoms. And you can't do that yourself. Archaeology, you need a permit to do it, and you need to have the know-how. And you can only get a permit if you are actually, a professor of archaeology and have a team and you have the funding and all of that. And you're only going to get all of that if you actually have the knowledge and ability. And that takes a lot of learning. And
education.
Exactly. It takes a lot of education. But here's the thing. We can run other experiments specifically on the legitimacy of the experiments of others. And so we could say, okay, well, let us look at the claims of radiocarbon dating and how it applies to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, this is the claimed method. Is that method sound? Does that method, is it internally consistent even? Because if it isn't, well, then it's not true. And let's see, does it match with material reality? Okay, well, if it does, well, then it's true. And so you find out if the method is right, and then you find out whether the people who were involved in conducting the experiments were actually correctly using the method. And so you can do that, like for the Dead Sea Scrolls. There was like 3 or 4 at first, and it's even been more since then. But at first, once they used radiocarbon dating on the scrolls, there was like 3 or 4 different teams in different countries that were not collaborating together or anything like that, and they ran AMS analysis on fragments of scrolls, and their dates were harmonious with each other. Well, that doesn't sound like a scam, and then it's been tested since by independent researchers and all of this. Over time, it's tested and all of this again, and the results always come back pointing to that same period of time. And then you can check that against the other dating methods. Well, does that match the archaeology? Does that match the paleography? And so you can test each one individually, test them according to each other, and it all comes out the same. And it's not just internal consistency that does it. It's that the methods can be shown to be sound in and of themselves, and you can determine that the people who are conducting the experiments had the knowledge and the ability. They weren't like a mechanic trying to conduct brain surgery. No, they're specialists in the field who are acknowledged by other specialists in the field. And, same thing with brain surgery. You want to know if someone's a good brain surgeon? You have to conduct an indirect experiment because you do not have the knowledge or ability to test whether they are actually good at what they do. Same thing when it comes to mechanic, like let's say a mechanic. Someone who has no knowledge of cars cannot directly conduct an experiment to see if a mechanic is really, if they really know what they're doing. Like they couldn't write up a test and give it to them and have them, answer it, and they wouldn't even know the correct answers themselves. So how could they test it? But what they could do is they could do an indirect experiment by seeing, well, when this mechanic does what they say they can do, does it actually work? Likewise, is this mechanic recognized by other mechanics as being a good mechanic? Those are indirect experiments, but they are experiments. It's not just someone trying to reason it through and say, well, it seems like this person's a nice guy, and they're saying, or a nice woman, whatever, this person's a nice person, and they're saying that they're a good mechanic, therefore they're a good mechanic. No, that's not the right reasoning, and reason alone cannot get you there unless it is actually true reason, in which case it will say, in order to really know, I need to conduct an experiment. That's the only way that reason will actually get you there, is if, the way to test the validity of reason is according to experiment. So it's not to cancel out reason, it's to say that genuine reason is experimental in nature.
That's why Sister White says to read the best authors.
That is precisely why she says that. Yes, I am glad that you said that, because that's the point. And there were times where Ellen White, you can read this in Testimonies Volume 3, there's this woman who believed that she knew her body. She knew, and she has all her personal experience about her own health and all of that, and she thought she knew what was best for her. And Ellen White said, look, your supposed experience means nothing because there are professional physicians here who are very well trained in this and know what they're doing, and they're conducting actual experiments, and they're saying that you're wrong. That this is the actual issue. Well, that's really what it is. We have to be self-distrustful, and even if our personal experience conflicts with the experimental data of others, but we can conduct an indirect experiment to verify the validity of their experiments, well, we better go with that. In other words, if your doctor or a team of doctors is running actual experiments on you and they say, hey, look, this is your problem, and you say, well, I feel it's this, because I felt like this before, and or I feel like this will help. Like I'm going to take this homeopathic remedy because I feel like it'll help because I've had an experience in the past where I had a lot of pain or I had whatever, and then I took this remedy and then I felt better. But doctors can show you, and chemists can take the homeopathic remedy to their lab and show that it is only a sugar pill. Well, at that point, the experience of the individual means nothing. It really comes down to the actual scientific experiment that was conducted. So that's why Ellen White said, read the best authors on these subjects, because experiment means more than just going through a circumstance.
And I don't know, not remembering if you mentioned this on tonight's meeting or not, because I just finished editing a study on basically what we're talking about tonight. And in it you read from the Silver Trumpet, Volume 9, page 8, I think, if I remember correctly, where you have several different Ellen White statements kind of dealing with this thing, but one in particular is from Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene, pages 109 to 110. And she's talking about, of course, she's talking about this thing here, but she mentions, if I remember correctly, it's been a few hours ago now that I was listening to this, but she mentions how there are many people who will even lead other people astray by telling them about their own experience and how things worked for them, and they're not genuine experiments, and so they're going to be doing people damage by saying or giving them recommendations for stuff that they can do to help themselves when they have no true, genuine knowledge on the subject. And she also says something along the lines of, there are many people or many invalids today who will ever remain such, because of this, and who are invalids because they've lived their life a certain way and they've done certain things in their lifestyle or their program or whatever, but they think that has worked for them. And so they promote their experience as the right thing to do. And when it's actually going to lead people to have the same negative results that they are currently experiencing.
Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene, page 109, 110, is one of my favorite statements of all time, period. Mm-hmm. And we have a series of videos on the Seven Angels Messages YouTube channel called Genuine Experience. And it is a detailed study of that very section in Ellen White's writings. And so that's highly recommended for everyone, especially if you've never gone through that series. But even if you have, this is central stuff, which is why I'm glad to take the time, even though it's not going directly on the community rule, but it relates to the principles of our study.
I'm glad to take the time to discuss these principles again because, again, it's central.
Well, and let me tell you, when I was listening to that today, and obviously I've heard it before more than once, many times in fact, the topic. But as I was listening to you reading that today, it really hit me harder than ever how I have to be so careful because it's in my nature. You know, I've gotten a lot better, to be honest, but it's in my nature to try to help people and to offer advice or what have you. And in the past, and probably even in the present, I've been very much in the habit of talking about things that I really don't know about, but I think I do. And, you know, I was just realizing, okay, well, you know, I have this issue and that issue and blah-da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, I may not know what has caused some of these issues, and who knows but what my experience is responsible for some of these problems that I have, you know, with the pain in my body and different things like that. And I'm going to try to tell someone to do what I'm doing when I don't know if everything I'm doing is the right thing or not. And I was just like, oh, man, that would be so awful if I were to lead someone down the wrong path. And it just made me recognize I'm going to be even more careful with advising people on things that I don't absolutely know that I have genuine knowledge on.
Absolutely. Such an important point. And, you know, I know that this can be difficult for people because everyone wants to help each other. And so, you know, it's easy to, oh, well, try this. Oh, you're having a problem? Well, try this. It's like, whoa, wait a second. Let's first establish what the problem actually is, what the cause is, and the correct way of treating it. I mean, that's really how we have to approach things. But this does apply to a whole lot, even beyond health, of course. Like you're saying, you know, just we end up talking about things like we know it when we don't. Mm-hmm. And we've all formed a bad habit of doing this, and we have to learn not to do this. And
I'm still discovering things that I thought I knew, and I'm only now realizing, oh, I don't know that. Oh, okay. Wait a second. Let me. I'm going to have to revisit all of that. You know.
Yeah.
So we have, you know, we should wrap this up within the next, 13 minutes, really. I just want to ask if anyone has any last comments or questions on what we've already been discussing.
Like me and my hydrogen peroxide and other things I've been telling everybody I run into. It's just my experience.
Sure, yeah, that's a good example. It's good to keep in mind, like, hey, wait a second, this may have worked for me in this circumstance, but maybe it won't work for someone else in their circumstance. Another thing, too, as we've been talking about this, I've thought of kind of, to keep in mind certain things that should kind of, like, set off red flags in our mind as to, like, when people make exaggerated claims about something. So, for instance, like, if someone puts forward a product, or even if it's not like a particular product, but just like an herb or whatever, and they're like promoting something in regard to health, if they're saying that it basically fixes everything.
Like it's a smart herb. It's adaptogenic. It knows what your body needs, and it'll just behave however you need it to.
Yeah, so stuff like that, Yeah, if someone's making claims like that, like, oh, this is going to fix everything, it's probably not true. I mean, that's just one thing to keep in mind, that if something's advocated, whether it's, some herb or some, food or some liquid or some drug or, colloidal silver or whatever, like there's a lot of claims that are made about a lot of things, and things are claimed to be like a cure-all. That's probably not true. Or like people often oversimplify something. If something sounds too good to be true, yeah, it probably is too good to be true. If something comes across as, like if something's promoted that's like just too easy almost, it's probably actually not necessarily going to be it. Like people often oversimplify very complex conditions like cancer and, oh, well, cancer's this or cancer's that. Well, actually, cancer is a whole bunch of different things. There's a whole bunch of different causes for cancer. The word cancer is actually a description of the effect, but it's not a description of the cause. There's genetic things related to cancer, but cancer can be caused by being exposed to certain compounds, but that's not the case all the time for all people. There's a lot of different causes, and so people often oversimplify, like, oh, well, it's this, or it's because of a lack of vitamin B17, or it's because of, oh, it's a fungal issue, or it's this or that. And it's like, no, those are all totally oversimplifications. So if you see something that is oversimplified, it's probably not true.
Yeah, that's the main thing. Oversimplified and with no real explanation for it. The things that I used to promote, I didn't have any backing for the majority of it. I did for some, but I didn't really think of it in those terms even. But there are some things that I promoted that are scientifically tested and are proven to have certain benefits. But the majority of the stuff out there hasn't been tested at all by really anyone. And then it is oversimplified and said, basically like, well, nature knows how to use it, and you just can't explain it. It just works. And it's the same thing with the energy. Well, you can't really, like meridian lines or whatever. Oh, well, you can't really explain it. You can't really measure it because it's so fine. But it's there, and we can prove it because of this and this. And then there's this false evidence that's really evidencing something completely different.
I just have to comment on this. Yes, okay, so apparently we cannot detect this so subtle energy that's flowing through our body and is totally governing our health, according to a lot of these people. Yet, through science, we can detect neutrinos, which is a particle so small and so evasive that you could pass it through an iron rod that is a light year long, and it will, in all likelihood, only bump into one other particle passing through iron for the distance of a light year. I mean, that is a very small, evasive particle. And
it really doesn't matter at that point how big around the rod is if it's a light year long.
Exactly. And so, if that can be detected, which it has been, I mean, you can detect, that's like, incredibly, and neutrinos are passing through us all the time and having no effect on our health because they're passing through us without actually interacting with our atoms.
They're just that small. They're still material.
Exactly.
And all that. But, all of this really just brings it home to me that most of my life I've thought I've known a lot more than I really do.
Yeah. Same for all of us. I do want to mention a couple more things as to keep your eyes out for in regard to claims. Like, okay, with health, if something is being advocated and it's supposed to be good for you because it's natural, that doesn't even make sense. First of all, the whole divide between natural and unnatural is a little bit skewed, because at what point, like, what do you call natural and what do you call unnatural, where everything is part of physical reality? And, if you look at a field of wheat, that's not quote-unquote natural, as in that doesn't just happen on its own. People have to plant it. If you look at an orchard, you've crowded out a whole bunch of plants and put in just one plant, one species of plant. Okay, that's pretty unnatural, yet it's not bad for you. There are things that we alter things all the time. We alter our physical surroundings. Here at the Living Branch Center, we're totally, altering the way,
changing
the landscape and, things like that. But it's not actually damaging to it. It's not against it, but it's altering it. And so in a sense, that's quote-unquote unnatural, but it's not really. Just like a bumblebee or, bees making a beehive and taking pollen and all of that. Well, guess what? They are beings, and they are altering plants, and they're doing all these other things. And we call it natural because they're an animal. Well, guess what? We're animals too, and we're doing human things just like bees do bee things, and it's part of the natural, process of life. And so if something is viewed as good just because it's natural, and something is viewed as bad just because it's quote-unquote artificial, that should be a red flag that doesn't make sense either, and that's probably a bogus claim. Because guess what? Not everything that's natural is good for you either. I don't recommend for anyone to come here to the LBC and walk out into the forest and start eating anything they see.
Yeah, I love the way my mom says, just because it's natural doesn't mean it's good for you. You wouldn't go out and eat poison ivy. You did.
Okay, yeah, exactly. And so there's a lot of things like that. Likewise, I do recommend seriously to try and validate claims, like in regard to health and in regard to other things. Find out what the people who are experts in the field have to say on the topic. Like, a lot of people promote things, and they don't end up even promoting what they are trying to promote. They end up just trying to discredit what are supposed to be the other options. So someone might say, oh, well, take this as a cancer cure, and then spend all their time trying to discredit mainstream medicine. Even if their discrediting of it was valid, it wouldn't prove that what they're trying to promote is valid. So just beware of those sorts of things. When people are trying to promote their thing by casting down the other, that's a false method. That doesn't make sense. Another thing, if people's primary means of advocating something is anecdotal stories, testimonials, that's not a valid evidence in favor of it. Look for experimental data and look for peer-reviewed experimental data. Don't just look for one person saying they did a test. No, look for peer-reviewed in scientific journals and see if there's a broad consensus on it or not among those who are specialists. So anyway, I know we're running short of time, but those are things that we definitely recommend in terms of this whole topic of, like, hey, experimental knowledge. Well, this is going to be helpful in running our indirect experiments in order to come to conclusions about a lot of things in life. So we have to bring the call to an end within basically the next 2 minutes, and perhaps even less. So would anyone be happy to volunteer to pray, and then we'll close off? And if there are questions and comments in regard to the last things we said, maybe write it down so you can remember, and we'll talk about it in tomorrow night's meeting. So anyway, someone to volunteer to pray?
I'll pray. Dear Heavenly Family, we just want to thank you so much for these calls and for sharing information and for the knowledge of how to do the experiments and get the knowledge for ourselves as individuals and not just count on somebody else. And we know we're short on time, but we just want to tell you how much we love you and how much we appreciate what you do in our lives and for the things you've done in the past and the things that you'll do in the future for us. Thank you so much. In many ways, be with those who are sick and depressed or whatever their condition may be. And we put all of our trust and faith in you. And we ask in the name of the branch. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right. Love you all. Lila Tov.
Lila Tov. Good night.
Love you all.